Chapter 6 of The Love of Monsieur by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. The Escape. They walked quickly along under a wall, keeping in the shadow. Vigot received his orders and went forward alone. When last they saw him, he was swaggering and staggering by turns up to the mercer's, where he began pounding lustily upon the door for admittance. Trice and Quinn Mornay dispatched by a side street to approach the tavern from another direction. At the Fleece there was no unusual sign. From an open window came the rattle of dice, the clink of the counters, and the laughter of men. The night being still young, many people were passing to and fro upon the streets, and Mornay and Cornbury, wrapped in their cloaks, looking neither to the right nor left, pushed open the door at the front and walked boldly into the room. Several drinkers lounged upon the benches, and there was a game of basset in the corner, but the players were so intent that they had no eyes for the new arrivals. Cornbury drummed loudly upon the floor with his foot, and one of the fellows, a pigeon-breasted ensign in a dragoon regiment, cast a loser's curse over his shoulder, but failed to recognize them. They ordered a drink, and the room on the second floor, at the head of the stairway. Mornay's reasons for this were obvious. He wanted a narrow passage where more than two men would be at a disadvantage, and where all opportunity for outside interference would be obviated. The host himself brought their lights and bottles. When he saw that it was Monsieur Mornay who was his guest, he started back in amazement. "Monsieur!" he cried. I thought—"
Yes, it is I. But keep your tongue, Papworth. Is Captain Ferrers here?" "No, sir. 2 notes have arrived for him, but—"
Mornay glanced significantly at the Irishman.
"You think he will come?" "I should be sure of it, sir." "Very good. When he comes, tell him Captain Cornbury and I are awaiting him." "But, sir, if you'll pardon me, the Fleece Tavern is no place for you, sir. There's been constables watching for you all yesterday and today."
Mornay laughed a little to himself.
"'Tis plain I am too popular. Listen, Papworth, I did you a good turn with the King when Captain Lyall was killed in your garden. Now you can return me the compliment." "Yes, monsieur, but—" "I'll have no refusal."
The man rubbed his chin dubiously while Cornbury told him their plans. When the Irishman had finished, Mornay slipped a handful of coins into his palm, which worked a transformation in his point of view.
"I'll do what I can, monsieur," he said, jingling the money. "But if there's to be fighting, the Fleece will lose its good repute forever."
Mornay and Cornbury both laughed at the long face and hollow note of virtuous regretfulness and resignation in his voice.
"Ochone, if there's ever been a duel in your garden once in 40 years, I'd never be the man to suspect it,"
said the Irishman. The landlord raised a deprecating hand and disappeared.
"The garden," growled Mornay. "I hope it may not be necessary to carry this matter there."
"But have you thought? He may not come up to your room."
"He must."
There was a cautious knock at the door, and Vigot entered, despair and distress written upon his features.
"Monsieur, ill news. There was no room to let at the mercer's. Tomorrow is market day, and the house is full to the garret. He would not let me even inside the door. Tonnerre de Dieu! And worse yet, monsieur, this place is watched. A number of black silent figures are regarding it from the shadows."
"You have read the man aright, Mornay," said Cornbury.
Mille diable! We must go by the roof. It is our only chance. Listen, Vigot. Do you go upstairs and out upon the leads. Curse the fellow! If you cannot get into his house at the bottom, you must get in at the top."
Vigot was off again as the landlord entered.
"Monsieur Mornay, Captain Ferrers awaits you below."
A quick glance passed between the two men. Mornay paused a moment before replying. "Tell him, Papworth," he said coolly, "that Monsieur Mornay has a quiet room upstairs where matters can be privately discussed. I will await him here." The man departed. Cornbury drained his bowl. "The man's an arrant coward. 10 guineas that he doesn't come up. Why, monsieur, he couldn't have entrapped us better himself. You've made the bait too tempting. He'll smell a rat. Poof, Cornbury! He has it all his own way. 20 guineas that he comes." Cornbury did not answer. He was bending towards the door, his mouth and eyes agape, as though to make his hearing better. But only the clatter of the game and the sound of the coarsened voices of the players came up the dimly lighted stairway. Upon the coming of this man hung Mornay's only chance for success. 5 minutes they waited in silence, but at last there was a sound of footsteps upon the stairs, and in a moment Captain Ferrers and Mr. Wynne stood before them. The exuberance and confidence of Captain Ferrers' smile found no echo in the face of Wynne, who looked sullenly and suspiciously at Cornbury and the Frenchman, as though the adventure were little to his liking. Mornay arose from his bench with great politeness, the perfection of courtesy and goodwill, and waved Captain Ferrers to a seat. Cornbury sat puffing volumes of smoke, with an appearance of great contentment and unconcern. Captain Ferrers was clearly taken off his guard, and his smile became the broader. He had at first thought Monsieur Mornay's promise to come to the Fleece a mere French flippancy. Surely after what had happened he could expect no clemency from Ferrers. Monsieur Mornay would have been flattered had he known how much of Captain Ferrers' thoughts he had occupied during the last few hours. The Frenchman's demeanor in the house of Mistress Clarke, his earnestness, his self-confidence, his assurance and poise, outdid anything that Ferrers remembered of that presumptuous person. A man with one leg in the grave or a lifetime of imprisonment staring him in the face would only play such a part because of one or two circumstances. He was using a desperate resort to gain some great end, perhaps to influence Mistress Barbara for clemency in the case of the death of Sir Henry Heywood, or else he was the real heir of the estate which Mistress Barbara was enjoying. To tell the truth, Ferrers did not care what he was. If the Frenchman came to the Fleece Tavern, he would be in the Tower by midnight. The prison would know no distinctions. He hated this man as one hates another to whom he is under obligations, and who has done him a great injury. And if he was the real heir, come to dispossess Mistress Barbara and balk him in the marriage that meant a fortune beyond the wildest dreams, the worse for him. He should suffer for it. All of these things passed again somewhat heavily through his mind. The air of unconcern and assurance which he met in the faces of both Mornay and the Irishman disarmed him. He thought how easy it had been to gain his ends, and comfortably fingered the whistle in his pocket, with which he should presently call in his hounds upon his enemy. Nor would his pistols be required. If he had wished, he could have sent his constables up from below to take these men in the trap they had made for themselves. but he enjoyed the situation. It was as easy as a game of quince with the mirror behind your opponent's back. "Monsieur Ferrer," began Mornay pleasantly, "I am meeting you tonight at great risk of my life. I thank you that you have kept my plans and this rendezvous a secret." Ferrer's small eyes blinked as though they had been liberally peppered, but the smile did not disappear. "What I have to say is to your great advantage. If after I am through you still wish to meet me, I shall be at your service below in the garden or elsewhere. Will you sit down?" The captain's lip twitched a little, and his fingers left the whistle and moved to a chair back. It was apparent that Mornay's mind was 1,000 miles from all thought of distrust or suspicion. He was as guileless as a child. Cornbury had filled another pipe and crossed his legs. "It will be useless to sit or talk, monsieur," said Ferrers coldly. "I have brought Mr. Wynne with an object which cannot be mistaken. If you are agreeable, Mr. Wynne will talk with Captain Cornbury as to the arrangements." He folded his arms and walked to the window with an air of rounding off a conversation. Mornay arose from his seat and walked around the table to the side nearest the door. "You must hear me, monsieur," he said calmly. "I offer you friendship and a proposition which cannot but be to your advantage." Ferrers had turned, but his head shook in refusal. "There can be but one proposition between us, Mornay." Mornay shrugged his shoulders. "Captain Cornbury," he said, "will you have the kindness to arrange with Monsieur de Wynne?" He stopped, bit his lip a moment, then turned to Ferrers once more. "I entreat you to listen to me. I have told you that I was the Vicomte de Brésac. No, it is no jest. I am René d'Agnasco. Eh bien, one day I shall prove it. What I ask is only to save a little time." He moved nearer to the Englishman until he could have touched him with his outstretched arm. "Listen, monsieur. If you will but give me the papers." There was a motion, if ever so slight, of the fingers of Ferrers' right hand. Only Mornay saw it, but it was enough. He sprang forward upon the man, and Ferrers' whistle never reached his lips. In his wish to give the alarm, he did not attempt to draw his firearm until Mornay's hands and arms had pinioned him like a vice. All the fury of a life of longing was in that grasp. It seemed as though the years of sweat and privation had wrought upon his will and energy for this particular moment. He bore the Englishman back until his head struck the wall, and they came to the floor together. At the first sign of trouble, Wynne had started for the door, but Cornbury was there ahead of him. Not until then had there been a word spoken, a cry uttered. But now, almost at the same instant that Mornay and Ferrers crashed to the floor, Wynne set up a loud cry, which resounded down the corridor and stairs. In a moment there was a sound of tumbling furniture, and the cries of men seemed to come from every part of the building. But Vigot and his two fellows from above were first upon the landing, and set so vigorously upon the men mounting the stairs that their ascent was halted, and they were thrown back in confusion. In the meanwhile, the struggle between Mornay and Ferrers continued. The Englishman had found his voice, and between his cries and curses and the clashing of the steel of Cornbury and Wynne, the room was now a very bedlam of sound. Either the blow of his head at the wall or the sudden fury of Mornay's assault had given the Frenchman the advantage, for Ferrers lay prone upon the floor,
and though he shouted and struggled, both of his wrists were held helpless in one of Mornay's sinewy hands. Suddenly Monsieur Mornay sprang away from the Englishman and to his feet, waving in his hands a packet of papers. He rushed past Cornbury and Wynne to the table, his eyes gleaming with excitement, with a fascination which made him oblivious to everything but his one overmastering passion. He tore the cover from the packet and examined the papers in the glare of the candles. In one of them he saw the name d'Agnasco. It was enough. None but a desperate man would have done so foolhardy a thing at such a time. Captain Ferrers was not slow to take advantage of his opportunity. He struggled painfully to his knee, and drawing his pistol, took a careful aim and fired at the Frenchman. Mornay's wig twitched and fell off among the candles. He staggered forward and dropped like a drunken man, his elbows on the table. Ferrers reached his feet and, drawing his sword, made for the door, but Mornay was only stunned. "Vigot! Vigot!" he shouted, rising. "Prenez garde, Vigot!" But before Vigot could turn, Captain Ferrers had rushed out and thrust the unfortunate servant through the back. As Mornay saw Vigot go down, he sprang after the Englishman into the corridor. Ferrers had set upon one of the fellows in the passageway at the same time that another and more determined attack was made from below. For a moment it seemed as though the constables had gained the landing. They would have done so had not Mornay, with an incomparable swiftness, engaged Ferrers and driven him step by step to the stairs, where at last he fell back and down into the arms of the men below. At this moment Cornbury, having disabled Wynne, came running to Mornay's assistance with two heavy benches which were thrown down the stairs into the thick of the men below, so that they fell back, groaning and bruised, to the foot of the stairway. Then, without the pause of a moment, Mornay dashed out the lights and, carrying Vigot, ordered a retreat up the second flight of steps. Vigot had a mortal wound and was even then at the point of death. "Monsieur," he said faintly, "c'est fini. Laissez-moi." There were some heavy chests of drawers in the corridor above, and Mornay directed that these be piled for a barricade. The stairway was here very narrow, and but one man could come up at a time, so two chests were balanced on the incline of the stairs, and two more were ready at the top to replace the others. When this was done, Mornay sent Quinn and Trice up to the next floor to gain the roof and find a way to the street. When they were gone, Mornay leaned over the dying man upon the floor. "My poor Vigot," he said. "Laissez-moi, monsieur," whispered Vigot. "C'est fini. They cannot hurt me. Over the roof a window is open into the garret of the mercers. Go, but quickly, monsieur, quickly." Mornay tried to lift him, but a deep groan broke from his breast. "No, monsieur, no." Mornay and Cornbury lifted him, and placing him on a bed in one of the rooms, quietly closed the door. By this time the men below had reached the landing. Mornay had one advantage. While the movements of the figures below were plainly to be seen, there was no light above, and the Frenchman knew that the constables could not tell whether his party were 1 or 6. It was plain that they did not relish an attack on the dark stairway. If they had not been able to gain the landing below, how could they expect to fare better here? They caught a glimpse of the dim outline of the chests of the barricade, but beyond that all was black and forbidding. Mornay and Cornbury only waited long enough to give the fellows above a chance to get over the roof, when they too quickly followed. As they crawled out of the window they heard the voice of Ferrers cursing the men for laggards, and at last a clatter of feet and the fall of one of the chests down the stairs.
They made their way stealthily but quickly across the leads to the dormer window of the mercer's shop, where they saw Trice beckoning. With a last backward glance they stole into the room. Its inmate was sitting upright in bed. Quinn was binding and gagging him with a kerchief and a sheet. They shut the window and took the key from the door, and passing into the hallway, locked their man in his room. It was none too soon, for a sound of shouts above announced that their escape was discovered. Upon this, Cornbury threw discretion to the winds, and with drawn sword went down the stairs 3 steps at a time. The rickety stairs swayed and groaned under this noisy invasion. Doors opened, and night-capped heads with frightened faces peered from narrow doorways. There was a lantern burning in a sconce upon the wall. This Mornay seized as he passed. At the head of the first flight the mercer came out, but Cornbury stuck him in the leg with the point of his sword, and seizing him by the back of the neck, pushed and dragged him down the stairs.
"The way out, ye vermin," he said. "Quick! No, not the front, the back door."
The man was sallow with terror.
"The back door?"
he chattered.
There is no back door." "A window, then,"
jerked out Cornbury.
"Quick!"
There was a warning prod of the sword. The man cried out, but staggered through the mercer's shop into a passage. Mornay and Cornbury thrust ahead of him. "Which way?" they cried in unison. He indicated a window. When it was opened, they saw it was not 6 feet from the ground. By this time the whole neighborhood was aroused, and cries and shouts resounded in all quarters. Mornay had put the light out, and pausing not a moment, stepped over the sill and let himself down into a kind of roofed alley or court which ran between the rear portions of the buildings. While Mornay covered the landlord to keep him silent, Cornbury and the others quickly followed. Without waiting a moment, the 4 men gathered themselves into a compact body and dashed down the alley as fast as they could run. It was a case now for speed and stout blows. There was a turn in the alley before it reached the street. It was on rounding this that they came full into the midst of a party of men who were running in to meet them. The surprise was mutual. All the commotion had been on the roof and in the main street, and there was so much noise that the constables had not even heard the footfalls around the corner. But Mornay's men had the advantage of being on the offensive. There was a hurried discharge of firearms, and a shout broke from Bill Quinn, but he kept on running. Cornbury fired his pistol at one man, and then threw the weapon full at another, who cut at him with a pike. In a moment they were through and in the street. A scattering of shots sent the dust and stones flying from a wall beside them. But the moon was gone, and aim was uncertain. The shouting had increased, and the sound of footfalls was just behind.
"Which way?"
said Mornay.
"Straight ahead," replied Cornbury. "To the river afterwards. Our chances with a boat are best."
They turned into a dark street, and Trice, who was slender and nimble-footed, led the way into the darkness with the speed of a deer. He wound in and out of alleys and narrow streets where the shadows were deeper, closely followed by Mornay and Cornbury. The pace was so rapid that Quinn was nearly spent. Seeing that if he were not heartened he would be taken, Mornay slackened and came back beside him. As he glanced around, he saw that 2 men were approaching rapidly, not 100 yards away.
"There's nothing for it,"
panted Cornbury.
"If I had a pistol I could wing the man in front."
Mornay drew his own from his pocket and handed it to him. Cornbury leaned against a wall and carefully fired. With a shout the man clapped his hand to his leg. He hobbled a few paces and then fell head over heels into the gutter. With singular discretion the other man slackened his speed and stopped to await his fellows, who were coming up in a body not far behind. Tom Trice had disappeared, but the river was not far distant. Cornbury saw the shimmer of it and said so to poor Quin. This plucked up his courage, and with a hand at either arm he managed to make so good a progress that they had crossed the wide docks and tumbled into a boat before the first of their pursuers had emerged from the darkness. Quin fell like a gasping fish under the thwarts, but Cornbury and Mornay pulled at the oars with such vigor that before a single black figure appeared upon the coping of the dock they had put 50 feet of water between themselves and the shore. There was a splash of light and another, and the bullets spat viciously around them. But they kept on pulling, and made the lee of a barge not far away in safety. When they heard the constables clatter down into one of the boats, they took off their doublets and pulled for their lives. The tide was running out, and they shot the bridge like an arrow, but they could see the black mass of the boat of their pursuers as it stole like some huge black bug from the inky reflection into the gray of the open water. There was a patch of light under the bows, and the frequent glimmer of the wind-swept sky upon the oars was far too rapid and steady for their comfort. A fellow stood up in the stern, giving the word for the oarsmen, and hard as the fugitives pulled, the boat gained steadily upon them. Bill Quin was useless, and even had he been able to row, there were only 2 pairs of oars. So they set him to loading the pistols, while they cast their eyes over their shoulders in search of a place of refuge. They knew if they made immediately for the shore they would fall too probably into the hands of the watch, for the streets here were wider, and there were fewer places for concealment than in the thickly settled part of the city which they had left. Their course was set directly across the bows of a large vessel getting under way. The anchor had clanked up to the bows, and there was a creak of halyard and sheet block as her canvases took the wind, a clamor of hoarse orders mingled with oaths, and the sound of a maudlin singing. But the boat of the constables was every moment splashing nearer and nearer, and Mornay, seeing escape by this means impossible, determined to lay aboard the ship and take his chances. Accordingly, they stopped rowing and waited until the vessel should gather way enough to come up with them. When the black boatload of men saw this, they gave a cheer, for they thought themselves certain of their game. For answer, there was a volley from 3 pistols, which sent one man into the bottom of the boat, so that the oars upon one side caught so badly in the water that the boat slewed around from her course and lost her way in the water. At the sound of the shots, a dozen heads appeared in the bows of the ship, which was coming up rapidly. "What ho there!" yelled a heavy voice. "Out o' the way, or I run you down!" Cornbury and Quin arose to their feet, but Mornay sat at his oars, keeping the boat broadside to the approaching vessel. "Jump before she strikes, man! The forechains and spritsail rigging!" The huge fabric loomed like a pall upon the sky, and they could see 2 long lines of foam springing away from the forefoot, which was coming nearer, nearer. "Look alive there!" shouted the gruff voice again. There was a grinding crash as Cornbury and Quin sprang for the rigging. Quin struck his head upon a steel stay, and had not the strength to haul himself clear of the water. With a cry, he fell back into the submerged boat. Mornay waited a moment too long, and the vessel struck him fairly in the body. He, too, fell back into the water, but as he was tossed aside, he fell as by a miracle into the friendly arms of the anchor, which, not having been hauled clear, dragged just at the surface of the water.
With an effort he pulled himself up, and at last climbed upon the stock, and so to the deck unharmed. A cluster of dark faces surrounded him, and a short, broad man with a black beard and rings in his ears thrust his way through. He looked at the shivering and dripping figures before him with a laugh. "So ho! Just in the very nick of the occasion, my bullies. Be three beauties. Ha! Ha! Jailbirds at a guinea a head." There was a sound of cries and the clatter of oars, but the vessel was moving rapidly through the water, and the constables were rapidly left astern. "In the King's name," shouted the voice of Captain Ferrers, "let me aboard." The man with the black beard ran aft and leaned over the rail towards the boat which was struggling in the water. "And who might you be?" he roared. "I represent the law," cried Ferrers, and his voice seemed dimmer in the distance. "These men are officers of the King. To arrest." The remainder of the sentence was caught in the winds and blown away. The black-bearded man slapped his leg. "The law! The law!" he shouted. Then he made a trumpet of his hands to make his meaning clear, and roared, "Go to hell!" He clapped his hand to his thigh and laughed immoderately. Monsieur Mornay, who had been looking aft over the bulwarks, saw the figure of Ferrers stand up in the stern sheets and shake his fist at the vessel. Then the boat pulled around to the half-sunken craft, which the fugitives had abandoned. All in dark shadow they saw Quinn pulled out of the water by the constables, and then the figures leaned over again and lifted something out of the water and passed it to the figure in the stern. The Frenchman took Cornbury wildly by the arm. "God! God!" he cried. "My doublet! The papers were in my doublet!" He put a hand upon the rail, and would have jumped into the water if Cornbury had not seized him and held him until the fit was past. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Love of Monsieur by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Barbara. After Monsieur Mornay's coach had rumbled away, Mistress Barbara excused herself to Captain Ferrers, and threw herself upon her couch in poignant distress and indecision. Why she had hated this Monsieur Mornay so, she could not for her life have told herself. Perhaps it was that she had begun by hating him. But now, when he had killed her friend and counselor, and had used violent means to approach and coerce her, now, when she had every right and reason for hating him, she made the sudden discovery that she did not. The shock of it came over her like the sight of her disordered countenance in the mirror. The instinct and habit of defense, amplified by a nameless apprehension in the presence of the man, had excited her imagination so that she had been willing to believe anything of him in order to justify her conscience for her cruelty. But now that he was gone, in all probability to the gallows, and she was no longer harassed by the thought of his presence, she underwent a strange revulsion of feeling. She knew it was not pity she felt for him. It would be hard, she thought, to speak of pity and Monsieur Mornay in the same breath. It was something else, something that put her pride at odds with her conscience, her mind at odds with her heart. She lay upon the couch, dry-eyed, clasping and unclasping her hands. What was he to her, that she should give him the high dignity of a thought?
Why should the coming or the going of such a man as he, scapegrace, gambler, duelist, and now fugitive from justice, make the difference of a jot to a woman who had the proudest in England at her feet? Fugitive from justice! Ah, God, why were men such fools? Here was a brave man, scapegrace and gambler, if you like, but gallant sailor, soldier, and chevalier of France, a favorite of fortune, who, through that law of nature by which men rise or sink to their own level, had achieved a position in which he consorted with kings, dukes, and princes of the realm, and boasted of a king for an intimate. In a moment he had rendered at naught the struggles of years, had tossed aside, as one would discard a worn-out hat or glove, all chances of future preferment in France and England, all for a foolish whim, for a pair of silly gray eyes. She hid her face in her arms. Fools, all fools. She hated herself that she did not hate Monsieur Mornay. Struggle as she would now that he was gone, she knew that the impulsive words that she had used when she had spurned him had sprung from no origin of thought or reflection, but were the rebellious utterings of anger at his intrusion, of resentment and uncharity at the tale he told. But what if it were true? She sat upright, and with a struggle tried dispassionately and calmly to go over, one by one, each word of his speech, each incident of his bearing, as he told his portentous story of the secrets of her family. How had Monsieur Mornay come into possession of all this information? She knew that Eloise de Brésac had died in France, and that the Duke of Nemours had sent the body to be buried on the estates in Normandy, where it lay in the family tomb. She knew that Sir Henry Heywood's intimacy with the Duke was of long standing, and that there was a mystery in regard to the death of this daughter of the house which had never been explained to her. Her grandfather had been ill at the time, she remembered, and had died before Sir Henry Heywood, and her father, who had gone to France, had returned. The story of the Frenchman tallied strangely with the facts as she knew them. How did Mornay know of the unfortunate woman's death at Amiens? Was the story of the Spaniard d'Añasco invented to comport with the family's traditionary hatred of the Spanish? Were the names Castellano of the ship and Ruiz of the boy mere fabrications to achieve an end? How did he know these things? The family history of the Brésacs was not an open book to all the world. No one but Sir Henry Heywood and herself had known of the visits to Paris and the death place of Eloise. And Captain Ferrers, how could she explain his loss of countenance when the tale was told? What papers were these, the very mention of which could deprive him of his self-possession? And what reason had he for keeping papers referring to her estate from her knowledge? They were matters which put her mind upon a rack of indecision. She should know, and at once. The Frenchman had planned well. He had proved that Captain Ferrers was concealing something from her. Of this she was confident, although in her discovery she had scorned to show Mornay that she believed him in anything. If Sir Henry Heywood had entrusted matters pertaining to the estate to Captain Ferrers, she was resolved that she should know what they were. She judged from his actions that Captain Ferrers had reasons for wishing these papers kept from her. She therefore resolved to learn what they contained. If he would not give them to her, and this she thought possible,
she would meet him in a different spirit and try with art and diplomacy what she might not accomplish by straightforward means. What if Mornay's tale were true? She asked herself again. What if these papers were the secret proofs of the marriage of Eloise de Bresac, with the birth of a son and heir to the estates in accordance with her grandfather's will? What if Monsieur Mornay could prove that he was Ruiz, son of D'Añasco, and had sailed from Valencia upon the Castellano? In the cool light of her reasoning, it did not seem impossible. She recalled the face of Monsieur Mornay and read him again to herself. It seemed as though every expression and modulation of his voice had been burned upon her memory. Had he flinched? Had he quivered an eyelash? Had he not borne the face and figure of an honest man? Argue with herself as she might, she had only to compare the bearing of the Frenchman with that of Stephen Ferrers for an answer to her questions. She arose and walked to the table by the window. The sun was setting in an effusion of red, picking out the chimney pots and gables opposite in crimson splendor, glorifying the somber things it touched in magnificent detail. She looked long until the top of the very highest chimney pots became again a somber blur against the greenish glow of the east. "I shall know," she murmured at last. "At whatever cost, Captain Ferrers shall tell me." And before the captain arrived the next day, she had resolved upon a plan of action. In justice to Monsieur Mornay, she would give his tale the most exhaustive test. For the sake of the experiment, she would assume that it was true. But if it were, and she believed it, the difficulty lay in getting Captain Ferrers to acknowledge anything. She must deceive him. If her deception did not avail, she would try something else. But of one thing she was resolved, that tell he should, or all the friendship she bore him should cease forever. Captain Ferrers wore a jubilant look as he came in the door. "My service, Barbara. You are better, I hope." She smiled. "Well?" "He's gone. Escaped us last night and got to ship in the river. By this time he is well into the channel." Mistress Barbara frowned perceptibly. "You have allowed him to get away?" she asked, her eyebrows upraised. "Yes," he muttered. "A very demon possesses the man. If I had my way, the fellow should never have left this room." She motioned to a seat beside her. "Tell me about it," she said. He sat and told her such of the happenings at the Fleece Tavern as he thought well for her to hear. But he omitted to mention the rape of the papers from his pockets. Of this attack he said, "After all, the fellow is but a common blusterer and bully. He waited for his chance, and then set upon me like a fishmonger." Her eyes sparkled. "And you?" she asked. "He had me off my guard, but as he broke away from me, I shot at him." He paused for a word. "As I would at a common thief." "And you did not kill him?" The words fell cold and impassive from her lips. He looked at her in some surprise. She had set her teeth, and her hands were tightly clasped upon her knees, but her eyes were looking straight before her and gave no sign of any emotion. "Why, Barbara," he said, "'tis truly a mighty hatred you have for the fellow. I thought if you were rid of him—" "I despise him!" she cried vehemently. "I hate him!" Captain Ferrers paused a moment, and the smile that had crossed his lips told her how sweet her words sounded in his ears. "Ever since he has been in London,"
she went on coolly.
"He has crossed my path at every root and levee. Wherever I'd turn, I'd see his eyes fixed upon me. From such a man it was an insult. His attentions were odious."
She gave a hard, dry little laugh.
"Why could he not have been killed then, before he told me this fine tale of his right to my fortunes and estates?"
"But surely you don't believe,"
Ferrers broke in.
"I do and I do not,"
she said carefully, considering her reply.
"It is a plain tale, and he tells it well, whether it be likely or unlikely."
"Why, Barbara, 'tis a palpable lie. Can you not see?"
"I can and I cannot,"
she said evenly. Then she turned around so that she looked full in his eyes.
"I care not whether he be the heir or no. I would not listen to his pleadings were he my cousin thrice over."
Captain Ferrers laughed.
"'Tis plain he has not endeared himself, mistress mine."
And then, with lowered voice and glance full of meaning,
"Do you really mean that you hate him so?"
It was the first time that his manner had given a hint of a secret. She turned her head away and looked at the opposite wall.
"I do,"
she replied firmly. "I do hate him with all my heart." Ferrers leaned towards her and laid his hand upon one of hers. She did not withdraw it. Her fingers even moved a little, as though in response to his touch.
"Barbara, this man,"
he paused to look down while he fingered one of her rings,
"is an impostor. But if he were not, would you still wish him dead?"
She looked around at him in surprise.
"Why, what? 'Tis a strange question. Is there a chance that it is true? That he is what he says?"
He halted at this abrupt questioning and did not meet her eye.
"No, Barbara, I have not said so.
But suppose he were the real Vicomte de Bresac, would you still wish him dead?" It was her turn to be discomfited. She averted her head, and her eyes moved restlessly from one object upon the table to another.
"Have I not told you that I hate him?"
she said. The voice was almost a whisper. Ferrers looked at her as though he would read the inmost depths of her heart. She met his eyes a moment and then smiled, with a little bitter irony that had a touch of melancholy in it.
"Can I find it pleasant thinking," she went on, "that the houses, the lands, the people who owe me allegiance, my goods, my habits, my very life are not mine, but another's?" A look of satisfaction crossed Captain Ferrers' face. He relinquished her hand and arose.
"What nonsense is this, Barbara, to be bothering your pretty head about such a matter? Zounds, dear lady, it is the silliest thing imaginable."
"Nay,"
she said, with a gesture of annoyance and a woeful look that was only half assumed.
"Nay, it is no nonsense or silliness. Should Monsieur Mornay come back, my quandary becomes as grievous as ever."
Ferrers had been pacing up and down, his hands behind his back.
"He will not come back. Besides, what could he prove?"
He stopped before her. She did not answer, but trembling, waited for him to continue.
"Listen, Barbara. There has been something I have had in my mind to tell you. The Frenchman's story has made some impression upon you."
She looked up almost plaintively.
"How could it fail?"
Then she went on, for his encouragement.
"It would make no difference to me whether he is the heir or no. So why should it make a difference to you?"
"That decides me. The fellow is gone forever.
He will never cross your path again. You think your quandary is grievous.
Even if the fellow came back, what could he prove? Nothing. I will tell you why. Because the only proofs of another heir to the estate are in my possession." It was out at last. The thing she had half hoped, yet most dreaded, to hear rang in her ears. She got up, making no effort to conceal her emotion, and, walking to a window, leaned heavily upon the back of a chair. "The proofs, the papers, are in your possession?" And then, with an attempt at gaiety which rang somewhat discordantly, "'Tis fortunate that they still remain in the hands of my friends."
"I have been through fire and water for them, dear Barbara, and will go again if need be. Last Wednesday night these papers were given me in sacred trust to safely keep or destroy. It were better had I destroyed them. As you know, my regiment is about to take the field. I have but just changed my lodgings, and had no place of security for them. So, since then, I have carried them upon my person until I could place them safely." And then he told her how they had been taken from him by Mornay, and how he had recovered them, to his surprise and delight, somewhat moist, but perfectly legible, from the doublet in the boat which was sunk by the vessel in the river. She listened to him with eyes that spoke volumes of her interest and wonder. When that was done, she asked him more of the secret, and he told her how her guardian had so long kept it from her, and how Captain Cornbury had carried the story to Mornay. He broke off suddenly and went over to where she stood. "Barbara, can you not put this matter from your mind? Will you ruin our day with this silly business? Have you no word for me? Have you no thought for me? No answer to the question that is forever on my lips, in my eyes and heart?" She looked around at him, her clear eyes smiling up with an expression he could not fathom. The level brows were calm and judicial. The eyes, though smiling, were cognizant and searching. "The lips, yes, Stephen," said she in a tantalizing way. "The eyes, a little, perhaps. But the heart—" She dropped her eyes and turned her head away. "The heart of man is a mystery." But Captain Ferrers was undaunted. He took in his the hand that hung at her side. "Why, Barbara," he said, "have I not given you all my devotion? Can you not learn?" She drew a little away from him. "I am but a dumb scholar." "Then do not add deafness to your failings. Listen to me. I have asked you again and again the same question. Answer me now, Barbara. Promise me that you will." She had turned around and faced him, looking him full in the eyes. "What would you do for me if I promised you what you wish?" "But my love, anything in my power to win, anything in my gift to bestow." She smiled gaily. "Very well," she said. "I shall begin at once. First, I shall want the papers in your possession." His face clouded. He dropped her hand and fell back a pace or two. "The proofs?" "The very same," she said coolly. "My trust!" he exclaimed. "I have sworn to keep them secret or destroy them." She turned away pettishly. "So much for your love, Captain Ferrers. You swear to give me anything. The first favor I ask, you refuse." "But my honor, Barbara! You would not have me break oath with the dead?" "Will you give me the papers?" she asked again, imperturbably. He looked at her uncertainly. "And if I do not give them to you?" "Then you may go." She pointed imperiously to the door. "You are cruel. And if I do give them?" Her face lighted. Ah, if you give them, perhaps—" He leaned forward.
"Well?"
Perhaps you may have an answer." When he took her hand again, she gave it to him unresistingly.
"If I give you these papers, will you promise me to be my wife?"
She had attained her end, and at the price she had expected to pay. And yet she hesitated. She dropped her head, and her figure seemed to relax and grow smaller under his touch. He leaned over her, expectancy and delight written upon his features.
"Will you promise, Barbara?"
he repeated. She straightened her head, but did not draw away as she answered at last. "I will." He put his hands in his breast, and drawing out the packet, laid it before her upon the table.
"There is my honor, Barbara. Take it. I give it to you willingly, as I give you my life."
She took the packet of papers and looked at the blurred writing upon the outside. Captain Ferrers made a step towards her, and taking her hand again, would have drawn her towards him. But as he approached, and she felt his breath warm upon her cheek, a change came over her, and she drew back and away from him to the other side of the table. Captain Ferrers could not understand. His brows knit angrily.
"How now, Barbara?"
he began. "Not today, Stephen. Not today, I pray you." She was half smiling, half crying. "Can you not see I am overwrought with my grief and worries? Leave me for the day. I will requite you better another time." She fell upon the couch and buried her face in her hands. Captain Ferrers looked at her quizzically for a moment, but the smile at his lips was not a pleasant one. Then he tossed his chin and walked towards the door.
"Very well, then.
Until tomorrow." He took his hat and was gone. For some moments Mistress Barbara lay there as one stricken and unable to move. But at last, with a struggle, she broke the seal of the packet, which she had held tightly clutched in her hand. Then, while the sun gilded again the chimney pots opposite her, one by one she read over the papers before her, the attestation of the nurse, Marie Greillot, and the witness, Anton Gratz, and Pierre Dauvet, the last testament of Eloise de Bresac, and her confession, the statement of the priest who had confessed her, and the description of the child, all sworn and properly subscribed to before an official of the parish of Saint Jacques. Then there were some letters from Juan d'Añasco, clear proof of Henry Heywood and Wilfred Clark's complicity in the plot. The tears came to her eyes and made even dimmer the blur of the ink in the faded documents. At last the letters became indistinct, and she could read no more. Far into the night she lay there. Her duenna would have entered, but she sent her away. Servants came with food, but she refused to eat. At last, when the reflection from the passing links no longer flashed in fiery red across her ceiling, and the sounds of the street were no longer loud or frequent, she arose, and putting her head out of the window, looked up at the quiet stars. The cool air bathed her brow, and the tranquillity and all-pervading equality of peace helped her to her resolution. The next day, as Captain Stephen Ferrers presented himself at Mistress Clarke's lodgings, he was given a letter. "This is the cry of a soul that suffers," it ran. "I have read one by one the papers you have given me, and from them an iron resolution has been forged with the warmth of passion and tempered with the wet of tears. Yesterday I was your promised wife. Unless you wish to be released, I am the same today. But this morning every estate that I possess, every revenue, all my fortune, in fact down to the last penny, has been placed under the crown. where it will remain until the rightful heir of the estates of de Brésac is found. Believe me, this decision of mine is irrevocable. If you would claim me for yourself under these new conditions, I shall still be the same to you. Barbara. Captain Ferrers left the house in some haste. A week later he went to France upon a commission to purchase guns for the Royal Artillery, and Mistress Barbara Clarke sailed as duenna to Señorita de Batteville, the daughter of the Spanish ambassador, to visit the señorita's uncle, who was governor of a castle at Portobello upon the Spanish Main. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Love of Monsieur by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. The Saucy Sally. Monsieur Mornay and his companions made but a sorry spectacle upon the decks of the vessel aboard of which the hand of destiny had so fortuitously tumbled them. The Frenchman had lost his doublet, hat, and periwig. The blood flowed freely from a wound in his head, and his bowed figure was slim and lean in his clinging and dripping garments. The Irishman stood near, with one hand upon the Frenchman's shoulder, watching him narrowly, fearful that in another mad moment he might throw himself overboard after his lost heritage. But Monsieur Mornay made no move to struggle further. He stood supine and subordinate to his fate. The light of battle, which had so recently illumined them, shone in his eyes no more, and the head which, by the grace of God, had been raised last night so that he could look every man level in the eyes, was now sunk into his shoulders, not in humiliation or abasement, but in a silent acquiescence to the whelming sense of defeat that was his. Cornbury, his red poll glowing a dull ember in the moonlight, stood by the side of his friend, erect, smiling, his usual inscrutable self. Presently, when a lantern had been brought, the man with the black beard came forward again and placed himself arms akimbo before the bedraggled figures of the fugitives. His voice was coarse and thick, like his face and body. As he leaned sideways to accommodate the squint of one eye and looked at them in high humor, an odor of garlic and brandy proclaimed itself so generously that even the rising breeze could not whip it away. "So ho!" he said again. "So ho! So ho!" while he swayed drunkenly from one foot to the other. "Queer fishing, even for the Thames, mateys. So ho! If there be luck in odd numbers, then here's the very luck of Danny McGraw. For all the oddities, ho, Redhead, whither was ye bound? Newgate or Tyburn, or the Tower? The Tower? Ye haven't got much of a hair or prisoner's estate." Cornbury looked him over coolly, and then with a laugh, "Bedad, my dear man, we'd had the smell of all three, I'm thinking." By this time half the crew of the vessel were gathered in a leering and grinning circle. "Psst!" said one. "'Tis the Duke of York in disguise." "The Duke of York!" said another. "Ay, ay, and the little ones, the Prince of Wales." Blackbeard thrust his nose under that of the Irishman. "Well, Redhead," he cried, "what's a crime? Murder or thieving or arson?" To lend force to his query, he clapped his hand down upon Cornbury's shoulder. The Irishman's eyes gleamed, and his hand went to his side. But he forgot that his weapon was no longer there. He shrugged a careless shoulder and drew away a pace. "Whist!" he said good-humoredly. "'Tis the king I've just killed."
"Ah, 'tis the red and the blood royal upon his head,"
said the drunkard, amid a wild chorus of laughter. Here a tall figure thrust through the grinning crowd, which gave back a step at the sound of his voice.
"Nom d'un nom!" he cried. "They shiver with the cold. A drink and a dip in the slop chest is more to the point, eh, Captain?"
Blackbeard swayed stupidly again, and, with a growl that might have meant anything, rolled aft and down below. The tall man took the lantern and led the way to the forecastle, whither the fugitives followed him. But it was not until they got within the glare of the forecastle lantern that they discovered what manner of man it was to whom they owed this benefaction. He was tall and thin, and his long, bony arms hung heavily from narrow shoulders, which seemed hardly stout enough to sustain their weight. From a thick thatch of tangled beard and hair, a long, scrawny neck thrust forward peeringly like that of a plucked fowl, and at the end of it a smallish head, with a hooked nose, black, beady eyes, and great projecting ears, was bonneted in a tight-fitting woolen cap which made more prominent these eccentricities of nature. This astonishing figure would have seemed emaciated but for a certain deceptive largeness of bone and sinew. His nether half ended in a pair of long shanks attired in baggy trousers and boots, between which two bony knees very much bowed were visible. By his manner he might have been English, by his language French, by his ugliness anything from a pirate to an evil dream of the devil. Monsieur Mornay had reached the forecastle in a kind of stupefaction, and it was not until the ugly man returned from below with some dry clothing and a bottle of brandy that he came broadly awake. Then, wet and shivering, he threw aside his shirt and drank a generous tinful of grateful liquor, which sent a glow of warmth to the very marrow of his chilled bones. For the first time he glanced at his benefactor.
"Mille Dieu!"
he cried in joyful surprise.
"Jacquard!"
The tall man bent forward till his neck seemed to start from its fastenings.
"By the devil's pot! Why, what? It cannot be! Monsieur le Chevalier,
is it you?" In his surprise he dropped the bottle from his hand, and the liquor ran a dark stream upon the deck. But regardless, he made 2 strides to Mornay's side, and, taking him by the shoulders, looked him eagerly in the face.
It is! Holy Virgin! Monsieur le Capitaine, how came you here?"
Cornbury had never looked upon so ill-assorted a pair, but watched them stand, hand clasped in hand, each looking into the face of the other.
"A small world, Jacquard! How came you to leave Rochelle?"
"Oh, monsieur," said the other, wagging his head, "times are not what they have been. The sea has called me again. My flesh dried upon my bones. I could not stay longer ashore. And a profitable venture.
Honest Jacquard, where do you go?"
"Monsieur, the Saucy Sally is no proper ship for you." He moved his head with a curious solemnity from side to side. "No place for you. We go a long voyage, monsieur." He broke off abruptly.
"But tell me, how came you in such straits as these?"
Then Monsieur Mornay told Jacquard briefly of the fight in the Fleece Tavern and of their escape. And after this Cornbury learned how Jacquard had been the Chevalier Mornay's coxswain upon the Dieu Merci in the Marine of France. But through it all Jacquard preserved a solemn and puzzled expression, which struggled curiously with his look of delight at the sight of Mornay. At last, unable longer to contain himself, he glanced stealthily around to where the men were swinging their hammocks, and said in a kind of shouting whisper,
"Monsieur, you cannot stay upon the Saucy Sally. Tomorrow, before we leave the channel, you must get ashore."
Mornay looked curiously at the man. "Why, Jacquard, you too? Your Sally is none so hospitable a lass after all. Upon my faith, 'tis too bad in an old shipmate. I had but just coaxed myself into a desire to stay, and here." Jacquard's face was a study in perplexities. He drew the fugitives to a small room or closet. When the door was shut, he sat down, his mouth and face writhing with the import of the information he could not bring himself to convey. "Odds life, man," growled Cornbury, "have you the twitches? Speak out."
"Monsieur le Chevalier,"
said Jacquard,
"'tis no cruise for you. We go to the Havana and the Maracaibo, and—"
He hesitated again. "Out with it before you get in irons. You hang in the wind like a fluttering maid."
"Well, monsieur, we are a flibustier, no more, no less," he growled. "Voila, you have it. I had hoped—"
To his surprise, Monsieur Mornay broke into a wild laugh. "You, Jacquard, honest Jacquard, a farbon, a pirato!"
"Well, not just that, monsieur. A flibustier," he said sulkily. "There is a difference. Besides, the times were bad. I went to the Spanish Main and became a buccaneer. Monsieur, listen. We are not a common pirato. No, monsieur. This ship is owned by a person high in authority, and Captain Billy Winch bears a warrant from the king. Under this we make a judicious war upon the ships of Spain, and none other. We have taken their ships in honest warfare, with much mercy and compassion. A very prodigy of virtue. Your Sally is too trim a maiden to be altogether honest, eh?"
Mornay paused a moment, looking at his old shipmate, then burst into a loud laugh.
"Bah, Jacquard, sail with you I will, whether or no. I am at odds with the world. From tonight I too am a flibustier. If I cannot go to the cabin aft, I will go to the forecastle, if not as master, as man, pardieu, as the very lowest and blackest devil of you all. You, monsieur, you."
"Yes, I have squeezed life dry, Jacquard. I have given my best in the service of honor and pride. They have given me rank and empty honors, and all the while have kept me from my dearest desire. From tonight, virtue and I are things apart. I throw her from me as I would throw a sour lemon." "A pirato!" Cornbury came around and placed a hand upon each of the Frenchman's shoulders, while he looked him straight in the eyes. "Monsieur le Chevalier,
he said soberly. Monsieur de Brésac. At the sound of that name he had staked so much to win, the Frenchman dropped his eyes before the steady gaze of the Irishman. But if his poor heart trembled, his body did not. Slowly but firmly he grasped the wrists of his friend and brought his hands down between them. "No, no, Cornbury," he said. "It must not be. That sacred name, even that will not deter me. It is done. May she who bears it find less emptiness in honor and life than I. I wish her no evil, but I pray that we may never meet, or the fate which makes men forget their manhood, as I forget mine tonight, may awake the sleeping god in me to a living devil, and demand that I make of her a very living sacrifice upon its very altar." "René, I pray you," cried Cornbury. Mornay did not even hear him. "I yield at last. From the time I came into the world I have been the very creature of fate. I have struck my colors, Cornbury. I have hauled down my gay pennons. I have left my sheep." He leaned for a moment brokenly upon the bulkhead, but before Cornbury could speak he started up. "No, no. Vice shall command here if she will. She will be but a poor mistress. Can she not serve me better than ambition and honor? Come, Cornbury, come to the Spanish Main. There'll be the crash of fight once more, and a dip into the wild life that brings forgetfulness. Come, Cornbury." Jacquard, who had been listening to this mad speech with his mouth as wide agape as his eyes and ears, rose to his feet.
"Monsieur,"
he asked joyfully,
"you will go with us to the Spanish Main?"
"Yes, yes." "And be a common buccaneer, a cutthroat?" said Cornbury the ironical.
"Aye."
"But, man, ye have no position here. Ye'll be cuffed and beaten, maybe shot by a young drunken captain."
"I've been beaten before." "Monsieur,"
gladly broke in Jacquard, upon whom the light had dawned at last.
"Monsieur, I am second in command here, and half the crew are French. I'm not without authority upon them. Set your mind at rest. With these men you shall have fair play."
He paused, scratching his head.
"With the captain it is another matter."
"Bah, Jacquard, I've weathered worse storms. Your captain is a stubborn dog, but I've a fancy he barks the loudest when in drink. Come, Cornbury, I'm resolved to start from the bottom rung of the ladder once more. Will you not play at pirate for a while?" "Unless I mistake," said Cornbury coolly, "I have no choice in the matter. The walking is but poor, and I've no humour for a swim. My dear man, ye may rest your mind on that. Ye're a madman, of that I'm assured. But I'll stay with ye a while." Chapter 9 of The Love of Monsieur by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Bras de fer. And so for the present it was settled. Monsieur Mornay sought rest vainly and crept upon deck at the first flashing of the sun upon the horizon. The Sally, dressed in a full suit of clothes upon her masts, went courtesying upon her course,
with a fine show of white about her bows and under her counter. The brig was not inaptly named, for there was an impudence in the rake of her masts and in the way she wore her canvas, which belied her reputation for a sober and honest dealing merchantman. There was a suggestion of archness, too, in the way her slender stem curved away from the caresses of the leaping foam which danced rosy and warm with the dawn to give her greeting, and a touch of gallantry in the tosses and swayings of her prow and head as they nodded up and down, the very soul of careless coquetry. But now and then an opalescent sea, more venturesome and intrepid than his fellows, would catch her full in the bluff of the bows and go a-flying over her forecastle in a shower of spume and water drops, which in the golden light turned into jewels of many hues and went flying across the deck to be carried down to the cool, translucent deeps under her lee. But she shook herself free with a disdainful, sweeping toss and set her broad bows out towards the open, where the colors were ever growing deeper and the winds more rude and boisterous, as though she recked not how impetuous the buffets of the storm, how turbulent the caresses of the sea. Something of the exhilaration of the old life came upon Monsieur Mornay as he sent a seaman-like eye aloft at the straining canvases. The Sally was leaving the Narrows and making for the broad reaches where the channel grew into the wide ocean. Far away over his larboard quarter, growing ever dimmer in the eastern mist of the morning, was the coast of France, the land where he was born, where he had suffered and struggled to win the good name he thought his birth had denied him. On his right, slipping rapidly astern, was England, where he had come to crown his labors with a new renown, and where he had only squandered that favor he had passed so many years of stress in winning, squandered it for a fancy that now was like some half-forgotten dream. It seemed only yesterday that he had been standing there upon a vessel of his own, looking out to sea. A year had passed since he had given up the command of the Dieu Merci and gone to Paris. A year of reckless abandon to pleasure at the gay court of Charles. A year in which he had lived and forgotten what had gone before. A year in which he had been born into a life that was his by every right. A dream? Yes, a dream. It was a rough awakening. He looked down at his rough clothing, his baggy red trousers with the tawdry brass buttons, his loose coarse shirt and rough boots, the rudest slops that the brig provided. He felt of his short hair under the woolen cap, and he wondered if this could be himself, the Chevalier Mornay, the cock of the birdcage walk, friend of princes and the intimate of a king. Astern, across the swirling wake, lay a city of pleasure. But the bitter smile that came into his face had none of the rancor and hatred. It spoke rather of failure, of disappointment, of things forsaken and unachieved. From these reflections he was surprised by the sound of a voice at his elbow. There beside him stood a fat man munching at a sea biscuit. His face, in consonance with the body, was round and flabby, but there the consistency ended, for in color it was gray, like a piece of mildewed sailcloth. The distinguishing feature of his person was his nose, which, round and inflamed, shone like a beacon in the middle of his pallid physiognomy. His voice was lost in the immensity of his frame, for when he spoke it seemed to come from a long distance, as though choked in the utterance by the layers of flesh which hung from his chin and throat. The pucker, which did duty for a frown upon his brow, became a fat knot.
"You was a passenger upon this ship, hey?"
he said, with well-considered sarcasm.
"You was a passenger? You think you make this voyage to America and do nothing, hey? By God, we'll see about that."
And all the while he kept munching at the sea biscuit, and Monsieur Mornay stood leaning against the rail, watching him.
"You was a French duke or something, ain't it? Well, we want none of the royal family aboard the Saucy Sally, and when I or the captain or Shacky Shackart give the orders, you jump. By God, I'll know why not."
But still Mornay looked at him smiling. He was in a reckless mood, and welcomed any opportunity that took him out of himself.
"Well?"
the Dutchman asked, his little thin voice grown shrill with rising temper.
"Why don't you move? Why you stand looking at me?"
And rushing suddenly forward, he aimed a blow of his heavy boot at Mornay, which, had it reached its destination, must have wrought a grave injury to the Frenchman. So great an impetus had it that, not finding the expected resistance, the foot flew high in the air. But the Frenchman was not there. He had stepped quickly aside, and, deftly catching the heel of the boot in his hand, threw the surprised Dutchman completely off his balance, so that he fell, a sprawling mass of squirming fat, upon the deck. The commotion had drawn a number of the crew aft, and the captain, reeling uncertainly to the roll of the vessel, came blinking and puffing up the after ladder. By this time the Dutchman had struggled to an upright posture and come rushing upon Mornay again, all arms and legs, sputtering and furious. But the captain, no matter how deep in drink, was a person with the shrewdest sense of his importance upon a ship of his own. He was jealous of all blows not aimed by his own sturdy fist, and it was his fancy that none should strike any but himself. It was therefore with a sense of his outraged office that he rushed between the two men, and with his bulky body and long arms averted the windmill attack of the burly Dutchman.
"Mutiny, boy, and not out of soundings. Stand fast, Gratz. Stand fast, I say. I'll do the billy coddling on this ship. Stand, I say. Now, what is it?"
Gratz stepped forward a pace and spat.
"Yeah, I give her orders, and she stumbled me backwards upon the deck."
"What?" roared the captain.
"So we'll see."
And he seized a pen from the rail. The situation was threatening. Winch was already striding forward, and his upraised pen seemed about to descend upon the luckless Mornay, when Jacquard interposed a long, bony arm.
"Fair play, Billy Winch. You'll slaughter the man. Out of the way. Fair play, I say, Billy Winch."
Jacquard stood his ground and only gripped the captain the tighter.
"Fair play, Billy Winch, I tell you. Gratz fell over his own feet. I saw it. Listen to me."
The captain paused a moment. The lie had distracted him, and in that pause Jacquard saw safety. The captain looked blearily at Mornay, who had made no move to defend himself, but stood with little sign of discomposure, awaiting the outcome of the difficulty.
"If Monsieur le Capitaine will but allow me—"
"By God!" broke in Gratz, "you shall not!" and made a wild effort to strike Mornay again. But this time Jacquard caught him and twisted him safely out of the way.
"By the devil's pot!" roared Winch. "Am I in command or am I not?"
He raised his weapon this time towards Gratz, who cowered away as though he feared the blow would fall.
"If Monsieur le Capitaine will allow me,"
began Mornay again politely,
"I would take it as a pleasure."
"You!" sneered the captain with a kind of laugh.
"You! Why, Frenchman, yon Gratz will make 3 of ye. He'll eat your skin and bones."
Jacquard smiled a little.
"Voila, Billy Winch," he cried, "the way out of your difficulty. A little circle upon the deck, a falchion or a half pike. Fair play for all, and—"
"Yaw! Yaw! Fair play! Fair play!"
yelled the crew, rejoicing at the prospect of the sport. Billy Winch blinked a bleared and bloodshot eye at Jacquard and Mornay, and then a wide smile broke the sluggish surface of the skin into numberless wrinkles.
"If ye'll have it that way," he grinned, "ye'll be stuck like a sheep. But 'twill save me trouble. So fight away, my bully, and be damned to ye."
Immediately a ring was formed, into which the combatants were speedily pushed. Gratz laughed in his shrillest choked falsetto, while he threw off his coat and leered at the Frenchman. The huge bulk of the man was the more apparent when his coat had been removed, for in spite of his girth and fat, his limbs were set most sturdily in his body, and though the muscles of his arms moved slothfully beneath the skin, it was easily to be seen that this was a most formidable antagonist, that he himself considered his task a rare sport, which would still further enhance his reputation among the crew, was easily to be perceived in the way he looked at Monsieur Mornay. And in this opinion he was not alone, for even Cornbury, who had pressed closely to the Frenchman's side, wore a look which showed how deep was his concern over his friend's predicament. Only Jacquard, of all those who stood about, felt no fear for Mornay. Upon the Dieu Merci he had seen the Chevalier do a prodigy of strength and skill which had settled a mutiny once and for all, and had earned him a title which had given him a greater reputation in the Marine of France than all the distinctions which the King had seen fit to bestow. And as Jacquard looked at him, slim and not over tall, but cool and deliberate as upon his own deck 3 years ago, the Frenchman became again René Bras de Fer, René the Iron Arm, who fought for the love of fighting only, and who knew nothing of fear on sea or land. That superiority in men which, in spite of every adverse circumstance, will not be denied, shone so conspicuously in the face and figure of the Frenchman that the row of hairy faces about him looked in wonder. There was a rough jest or two, for yon Gratz had won his way from the bowsprit aft by buffets and blows, and had waxed fat in the operation. To them he was the very living embodiment of a fighting devil of the sea. But many of them saw something in the cool, impassive expression of the Frenchman, a something which had won him friends and enemies before this, and were silent. The Frenchman, with a quiet deliberation, rolled the sleeves of his shirt above his elbows, and took the half pike that was thrust into his hands. It has been said that the Chevalier Mornay was not above the medium height, nor, with the exception of an arm which might have seemed a little too long to be in perfect proportion, gave in his appearance any striking evidence of especial physical prowess. He had been known in London for a graceful and ready sword, and in his few encounters he had never received so much as a scratch. But even Gratz was stricken with wonderment at the appearance of the forearm, which his wide sleeves had so effectually concealed. The arm of the Chevalier, as he brought his pike into a posture of defense, showed a more remarkable degree of development than he had ever seen before in any man, Frenchman or Englishman, of his stature. The legs, strong and straight as they were, with a generous bulge at the calf, betrayed nothing of this wonderful arm, which, swelling from a strong, though not unslender wrist, rose in fine layers of steel-like ligament, tangled and knotted like the limbs of an oak, and up above the elbow the falling cotton shirt scarcely hid the sturdy bulk of muscle which swelled and trembled as the fingers moved the weapon down upon the guard to resist the furious attack of the Hollander. Gratz prided himself no less upon his use of the pike than upon his use of his fists and boots, and thinking to end the matter in a summary fashion which might atone for his somewhat awkward fall upon the deck, he began thrusting hotly and with a skill which had hitherto availed his purposes. But he soon discovered that with this Frenchman, whom he had so hardily challenged, he was to have no advantage either in the reach or in the knowledge of the game. Mornay's play, he quickly learned, was to allow him completely to exhaust himself. This, instead of teaching him caution, only increased his fury, so that in the end of a few moments of fruitless exertion he found himself puffing like a great grampus, the perspiration pouring blindingly into his eyes and down his arms until his fat hands grew moist and slipped uncertainly upon the handle of his weapon. The cloud that had hung upon Cornbury's face at the beginning of the combat had disappeared, and with a childish delight in the clash of arms, he watched his friend slowly but surely steal away the offensive power of the Dutchman, whose look of confidence had been replaced by a lightness of eye and a quivering of the forehead and lips which denoted the gravest quandary of uncertainty. Monsieur Mornay was breathing rapidly, but his brows were as level, his eye as clear, his hand as steady as when he had begun. In a few moments the struggle which had promised such dire results became a farce. The Frenchman had suddenly assumed the offensive, and beating down the guard of the other, began pricking him gently with rare skill and discrimination in different conspicuous parts of his anatomy. The Chevalier's weapon was sharp, and the skin of Jan Gratz was tender, but so nicely were the thrusts of the Frenchman tempered to the occasion that they did no more than draw a small quantity of blood at each place, which oozed forth in patches upon his moist and clinging shirt, so that he presently resembled some huge spotted animal of an unknown species which disaster might have driven from its fastness in the deep. It would have been a remarkable exhibition of skill with a cut and thrust sword or a rapier, but with a half pike it was little less than marvelous. Jan Gratz struggled on, his tired arms vainly striving against the Frenchman's assaults.
Once, when the Dutchman had been disarmed, Monsieur Mornay generously allowed him to regain his weapon, choosing the advantage of Jan Gratz' posture, however, to complete the circle of his punctures by a prick in the seat of his honor, which quickly straightened him again. When the game had gone far enough, and the pallid, pasty face of Jan Gratz was so suffused that it looked little less red than his nose or the blood upon his shirt, and his gasps for breath were become so short that they threatened to come no more at all, Monsieur Mornay threw his weapon down upon the deck and, breathing deeply, folded his arms and stood at rest. "Mynheer," he said, "it was a mistake to have begun. I am the best half pikeman in France." The Dutchman blinked at him with his small pig eyes, out of which the bitterness of his humiliation flashed and sparkled in a wild and vengeful light. The Frenchman turned his back to pass beyond the circle of grinning men, who had not scrupled to hide their delight and admiration at his prowess in vanquishing their bully. But Gratz, whose exhaustion even could not avail to curb his fury, put all the small store of his remaining energy in a savage rush, which he directed full at the back of the retiring Frenchman. A cry arose, and Mornay would have been transfixed had not Cornbury intercepted the cowardly thrust by a nimble foot, over which the Dutchman stumbled and fell sprawling into the scuppers. The point of his weapon grazed the arm of Mornay and stuck quivering in the deck, a yard beyond where he had stood. Jacquard rushed to the prostrate figure in a fury at his treachery, but the man made no sign or effort to arise.
"By the Holy Rood, a craven stroke!" cried the captain, fetching the Dutchman a resounding kick, which brought forth a feeble groan. "Get up!" he roared. "Get up and go forward. Hods niggers, we want none but honest blows among shipmates."
Jan Gratz struggled to his feet and stumbled heavily down into the deck house. Jacquard was grinning from ear to ear. If he had planned the combat himself, the result could not have been more to his liking. The favor of Billy Winch was no small thing to win, and Monsieur Mornay had chosen the nearest road to his heart. The captain, after hurling a parting curse at the Dutchman's figure, slouched over to Mornay.
"Zounds, but ye have a hand for the pike, my bully. Have ye aught o' seamanship? If ye know your hangles, ye're the very figure of a mate for Saucy Sally, for we want no more him."
And he jerked his finger in the direction taken by Jan Gratz. Mornay laughed.
"I've had the deck of a taller ship than Saucy Sally."
Billy Winch grasped Mornay by the hand right heartily.
"Come, what d'ye say? Me and Jackie Jacquard, and you, we three aft. We've need o' ye. Zounds, but ye've the useful thrust and parry."
Then he roared with laughter.
"And I'm mistaken if you're not as handy a liar as a pikeman. I've seen the play of the best in the French marine, and Captain René Mornay would have a word to say with ye as to who's the best half pikeman in France."
Jacquard held his sides to better contain himself. His mouth opened widely, and his little eyes were quite closed with the excess of his delight. Mornay and Cornbury smiled a little, and the Frenchman said, with composure, "Perhaps Monsieur le Capitaine Mornay and I are not strangers. But he holds his reputation so low, and I mine so high, that I cannot bring myself to fight him." Here Jacquard could no longer contain himself.
"Can you not see further than the end of your bowsprit, Billy Winch?" he cried, and while the captain wondered, "Can you not see, stupid fish? 'Tis Bras de Fer himself."
Blackbeard fell back a step or two in his amazement, while a murmur swept over the crew, who, loath to leave the scene, had remained interested listeners to the colloquy.
"What? René, the iron arm, aboard the Sally,"
said the captain, approaching the Frenchman again.
"So ho! Though, by St. Paul's, ye're not unlike, and with a wig and a doublet. 'Pon my soul, Jackie Jacquard, but I believe 'tis the truth. Say, is it so, master?"
"I am René Mornay," said the Frenchman.
"So ho!" he roared in delight. "The Sally shall give ye meat and drink, and make a bed to ye, and when ye will shall set ye ashore in France, or if ye care for the clashing of arms, shall show ye the way to the galleons of Spain. Come, let's below and drink to better understanding."
It was thus that Monsieur Mornay sailed forth to the Spanish Main. End of chapter 9.